December 8th, 1941. 24 hours after the smoke stopped rising from Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his quarters aboard the battleship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay. Attack had exceeded almost every tactical expectation. 5 battleships sunk outright. 18 ships in total sunk, run aground, or seriously damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft burned on the ground before their pilots could reach them. 2,403 Americans killed and more than 100 wounded in under 2 hours. By any measure, it was a success. Yamamoto did not celebrate. He had spent years living in America, studied at Harvard, watched the factories of New England, crossed the oil fields of Texas, seen the country from the inside, not as a tourist, but as a student of its capacity. He understood, and what almost no one in the Imperial War Cabinet chose to hear was this: Japan had not wounded a weakened rival. Japan had ignited something it could not extinguish. 2. To understand how Japan arrived at December 7th, you have to go back further, and to the assumptions embedded in their strategic planning long before the first Zero left the carrier deck. Japanese military doctrine in 1941 was built on a model drawn from their own history. In 1905, Japan had crushed the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, a single, overwhelming naval engagement that ended the Russo-Japanese War and forced Russia to the negotiating table. The lesson the Imperial General Staff took from that victory was direct. Decisive early force creates negotiated peace. They believed the same logic applied to America. Theory was not irrational on its surface. The United States in 1941 was a country that had spent 2 decades pulling back from foreign entanglement. Public opinion polls showed consistent opposition to involvement in another European war. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts. The debate between isolationists and interventionists was loud, unresolved, and very much ongoing. From the outside, it looked like division, like softness, like a country that did not want to fight. Japan's planners looked at this picture and drew the wrong conclusion, calculated that a sudden, overwhelming strike, destroying American naval power in the Pacific, seizing the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and presenting the United States with a war it would need years to contest, would produce the same outcome as Tsushima. America, they believed, would negotiate. What they failed to account for was a distinction their own strategic history had never required them to consider: the difference between a country that chooses not to fight and a country that cannot. Russia, in 1905, had been exhausted, politically fractured, and facing revolution at home. America, in 1941, had the largest industrial economy on Earth, the only one not yet committed to war. Yamamoto had tried to say this plainly. He had said it in letters, in strategic memoranda, in conversations with colleagues who did not want to hear it. In January 1941, he wrote to a senior Diet member that true victory over the United States would require Japanese forces to advance to Washington itself and dictate terms from the White House. He did not write this as a battle plan. He wrote it as a warning, to say that the only victory Japan could achieve was one that was completely impossible. Its meaning was precise. A short war was all Japan could win. A short war was the only kind the United States would allow Japan to have. Sleeping Giant Line, the famous quote attributed to Yamamoto after Pearl Harbor, has never been verified. No document confirms he spoke or wrote those exact words. Scient. But the sentiment was entirely consistent with everything he had said and written for years. Yamamoto understood with uncomfortable clarity that Japan's industrial base produced roughly 1/10 of America's steel output. The country he was proposing to fight had an economy 11 times the size of Japan's and had not yet turned it toward war. His superiors listened. They disagreed. They believed the Americans were soft, comfort-loving, divided, that they would exhaust their will to fight before they could bring their factories to bear. This was the fatal error, not a failure of data, but a failure of imagination. The data was available. Japan's naval intelligence attaché in Washington had been filing accurate reports on American industrial capacity for years. Conclusions drawn from those reports were filtered through and not be questioned, that the American civilian would not endure the cost of a long war, and that their government would not sustain the political will to fight one. They had confused America's reluctance with America's limits. On the morning of December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. He spoke for 7 minutes, called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Congress voted for war within the hour. The Senate vote was 82-0. The House vote was 388-1. A single dissenting vote came from Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, the only member of Congress who had also voted against entry into the First World War. She was surrounded by colleagues who had spent months opposing intervention. By afternoon, she required a police escort to leave the building safely. That is how complete the shift was. American machine gun had been partially converted to war production before Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt had been quietly pushing armament since 1939. But what happened after December 7th was categorically different in scale and speed. By January 1942, the War Production Board had taken control of civilian manufacturing priorities. Automobile plants stopped making cars. Ford's massive Willow Run facility, an L-shaped plant stretching nearly a mile under one roof, began producing B-24 Liberator bombers. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant, which had produced 331 tanks in all of 1940, turned out 29,497 in 1943 alone. Note: verify 1940-1943 tank figures against US Army ordnance. Production of final records before aircraft manufacturers that had employed an average of 400 workers each in 1935 were employing 100,000 each by 1943. Aviation workforce grew from roughly 100,000 people to 2.1 million in less than 4 years. Military aircraft production, which had totaled approximately 6,000 units in 1940, reached roughly 86,000 in 1943 and exceeded 96,000 in 1944. The United States built more aircraft in a single year than Japan produced across the entire war. Roosevelt had set production targets after Pearl Harbor that his own advisors considered propaganda. Numbers so large they assumed they were meant to intimidate rather than achieve. They were wrong. In the 3 years following the Battle of Midway, Japan completed 6 fleet carriers. The United States commissioned 17 of the Essex class alone. This was not a country that could be stunned into submission. This was a country that had been waiting for a reason. 16 weeks after Pearl Harbor, on the morning of April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers lifted off from the carrier USS Hornet, roughly 650 miles off the coast of Japan. No land-based bomber had ever successfully launched from an aircraft carrier. The mission, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, had been planned in secrecy and considered borderline impossible by most of the officers briefed on it. The bombers reached the Japanese home islands and struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. The physical damage was minor. No military facilities of significance were destroyed. The aircraft, running low on fuel, could not return to the carrier. Most crews ditched in China or the Soviet Union, and several airmen were captured by Japanese forces. By conventional military accounting, the Doolittle raid was barely a tactical operation. Japan's strategists knew this. But that was not the point. The point was that it happened at all. Japan's government had promised its people that the home islands were beyond reach, that the Pacific defensive perimeter was impenetrable. The raid shattered that assurance in a single morning. The psychological effect inside Japan's military command was severe enough to alter their entire strategic posture. Admiral Yamamoto pressed for an accelerated operation to destroy the remaining American carriers before they could launch. Another such humiliation. Pressure led directly to the decision to attack Midway Island, which was precisely the trap America was waiting to spring. By June 1942, American codebreakers at the Pearl Harbor Intelligence Unit, code-named Hypo, had broken enough of Japan's naval communication cipher to determine the target, timing, and fleet composition of the planned attack. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked in a windowless basement for weeks. By late May, they knew Yamamoto was coming. They also knew he was bringing the Kido Butai, the same carrier strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, in what he expected would be the decisive battle of the Pacific War. Salmon had assembled a fleet of extraordinary size: 4 heavy aircraft carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers. Against this, Admiral Chester Nimitz could send 3 carriers, and only 3, because the Yorktown, badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea weeks earlier, had been written off by Japanese intelligence as out of action. Pearl Harbor's repair crews worked 72 hours straight to make her seaworthy. She reached the battle term. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, American torpedo bombers launched their attack runs against the Japanese carriers. They were devastatingly ineffective. Obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo planes flew slow, straight, and low. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft guns cut through them methodically. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet lost all 15 aircraft. Not one torpedo found its mark, but they had pulled the Zeros down to sea level, high above unseen. SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese carriers. Their decks were loaded with fuel lines and armed aircraft. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were on fire and beyond saving. The 4th, Hiryu, launched 2 attack waves that crippled the Yorktown. Dive bombed her that same afternoon and left her burning. She sank the following day, panned. In those 5 minutes of dive bombing on the morning of June 4th, Japan lost the core of the naval air power it had spent a decade building. 4 carriers sunk, more than 300 aircraft destroyed. Some of the most experienced aviators in the Imperial Japanese Navy killed. The Japanese cancelled their plans to invade New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Offensive in the Pacific was over. Japan's strategic planners had built their war around the assumption that their opponents would be slow to recover and slower to respond. At Midway, the response was faster, more complete, and more decisive than they had modelled as possible. They had been certain of American sluggishness. Certainty is expensive in war. After Midway, the course of the war was not in doubt. Only its length. The United States would go on to produce, by the end of the war, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. American industrial output, already the world's largest in 1940, doubled in size across the 4 years of the war. By 1944, more than half of all industrial production on Earth took place inside the United States. Joseph Stalin, toasting Allied leaders at the Tehran Conference in 1943, acknowledged it directly. Without American machines, he said, the United Nations could never have won the war. Japan had access to much of this data before December 7th. Their intelligence attaché in Washington had filed accurate reports on American industrial capacity throughout the late 1930s. Their own planning documents acknowledged the disparity in raw material reserves, factory output, and naval shipbuilding rates. Yamamoto himself had laid out explicitly why a prolonged war was unwinnable. None of it changed the decision. The failure was not in the intelligence. It was in the assumption that underlay every interpretation of that intelligence, that industrial capacity is only relevant if the enemy has the will to use it. For Americans, divided, comfort, seeking, separated from the war by 2 oceans, lacked that will. It was an assumption built not on analysis, but on contempt. The leaders of the Imperial War Cabinet had looked at American political division and seen weakness. They had looked at American prosperity and seen softness, seen the years of American non-intervention, and concluded that the country preferred comfort to sacrifice. They had, in other words, seen exactly what they wanted to see and missed almost entirely what was actually there. A country that could, when sufficiently provoked, turn the entire weight of its civilian economy toward a single purpose. Country whose workers would spend 4 years building things they would never see in factories that had not existed 2 years before, for a war they had not wanted. December 8th, 1941, the Nagato, Hiroshima Bay. The reports coming in from Pearl Harbor confirmed the numbers. The tactical success was real. What Yamamoto knew, sitting with those reports, was that the numbers were beside the point. He had wanted, if war was inevitable, a single catastrophic blow to the American fleet that would buy Japan 18 months, perhaps 2 years, to consolidate the territories it had seized and build a defensive perimeter that a war-weary America might choose not to breach. Instead, he had given them a reason. The factories were already converting. The workers were already filing in. The ships were already being laid down in the keels. All of it invisible from the surface of the Pacific, where the Japanese fleet was sailing home to celebrations it had not earned. 3 years, 5 months, and 8 days later, the war in the Pacific was over. The final American death toll, approximately 111,000 killed in the Pacific theater alone. The Japanese death toll, from all causes, military and civilian, is estimated between 2.6 and 3.1 million. The men who planned Pearl Harbor had not been uninformed, Chand. They had not been irrational by the logic of their own doctrine, simply believed, with a confidence that no evidence could dislodge, that they understood something about Americans that the Americans did not know about themselves. They were wrong about that. The question that lingers is not whether the miscalculation was avoidable. It clearly was, as Yamamoto's warnings show. The question is how institutional certainty calcifies to the point where accurate information cannot penetrate it. How a military command, in possession of the facts, chooses the story it prefers over the reality of those facts. That question did not begin in 1941. It has not ended since.